Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. We're just about at lunchtime, and so bear with me. I will talk very quickly, trying to fit 4 years of research into 10 minutes. Just a little bit about myself. I am from Canada, but I have a long-standing connection to New Zealand. My first trip here was 32 years ago. And in the last 10 years or so, I've been coming back and forth pretty much every year while my husband did research in Canterbury. So while I was not here during the earthquakes, Christchurch has like a special home to us, and so we mourn what happened to our beautiful city. And I apologize if this is repetitive for many of you, but my research, my participants started right at the very beginning with their experiences of the earthquake, so I am going to review what happened in Christchurch. So it wasn't supposed to happen in Christchurch. It was supposed to happen here in Wellington. Took everybody by surprise, and it was very shocking. And it was a sequence of 5 major earthquakes, interspersed with 15,000 aftershocks. And as one of my participants said, people don't realize that the earth didn't stop shaking for 2 years. And the intensity, 2.2 times the force of gravity. That was the second earthquake on February 22nd, where most of this damage was sustained and 185 people did die. 80% of the downtown, the CBD, was damaged. The central city was basically destroyed. And it was the first time that a national state of emergency was declared in New Zealand. So my question was, how did spirituality, or could spirituality, play a role in recovery? And like Noel, I went and collected stories. This is qualitative research. I recruited 16 participants and basically got them to tell me about their personal, spiritual, or meaningful experiences, so their narratives of how they coped with the earthquakes. Now, this is just a sampling. This is only 8 titles of 8 of the vignettes that came out of the 16. But it's going to give you a flavor of what came out. So from nature being the major focus in the spiritual experience to a very intense moment of clarity, 2 people entered into actual very mystical experiences, like going into other states of consciousness. And then simply understanding kindness being the key to this particular person, for people in her community, but also to herself. So from all of these, there were 4 core elements that came out. And I'm calling this transcendent coping. So acceptance was sort of the first one that came through. People were in shock, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. They actually stopped and were still. And in effect, this provided them an acceptance of the situation, but also an opening and kind of a surrender. And then this led often to the clarity of their thoughts and actions. So it became really clear what was important to them. What are their values? Like one of the participants said she wasn't interested in having the latest technology anymore, or going to the mall and going shopping. And another fellow said it was all about the people in his life. Another fellow said, you don't think about the extra $10,000 that's going to be in your bank account after you die. It's the experiences, the people, what's important to you, as Lucy's talked about. Next is connection. All of them spoke about connection. Connection in the community, to their family, their friends, their children, people they loved. Nature. Nature was a very strong theme. And animals, pets, were very, very important. All of these things brought comfort and a sense of security. And then finally, transcendence. For some people, yes, this was from a religious framework, a more theistic approach, but many others, it wasn't necessarily theistic. It was more transcending the everyday reality and their everyday way of looking at things, their everyday perspective. So together, I'm likening this to a model of a braided river. This is the Waimakariri, which is one of the largest braided rivers in New Zealand. It's in North Canterbury. And in a braided river, there are different channels. You can see the water separated into different lines. And the water flows around these little islands of gravel and silt that have built up, so sort of like the stress. But every once in a while, a braided river will reset itself. And that's, there'll be floodwaters that come through, and all of the channels merge together to create one big, strong flow. And during that process, the silt, the gravel gets, churned around, oscillated around, and everything gets cleaned out. And then afterwards, it settles down and moves back into these channels. And so the river actually looks like it's getting smaller, but it's always running. It's always running from the mountain to the sea. And so transcendent coping is sort of like this internal energy that exists all the time. And you can call on it. My research is framed in positive psychology as well. And Abraham Maslow talks about peak experiences. But this isn't necessarily a big, wild peak experience. He also talked about plateau experiences, which are just these little pockets of quietness, blissfulness that happen in our lives. And we can almost summon them at will. And they're really part of our everyday life. So this is the braided model of transcendent coping. And I'll finish now with just one of, unlike Noel, I'm not going through all of the vignettes, but I'll finish with one of them. A spiritual life in a material world. This was a gentleman who really, to me, typified the process of what can happen when you open yourself up to transcendent coping. He worked in a union, and he was in a very often combative environment. And so for him, through the earthquakes, he had rejected religion and God. He couldn't even bring himself to use the word God. But when the earthquakes happened and there was this river of mud coming down his street and it was piling up in his backyard, he stopped and went, there has to be something larger than just us. And so he said he stepped up to his spiritual life. And before, when he would be dealing with people, his family and friends, or difficult situations, and especially at work, he used the body language of this. He'd, go at it and be quite sharp and edgy. But after spending time developing this transcendent approach, he said he would go into meetings or in any aspect of his life with this. He went like this. So I thought that was a perfect example of how you can embrace this peacefulness and have it empower you. And one last frame. I'm talking very fast. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much, Susan. Questions, comments? Yes.
Tēnā koe, Vicky Hirini from the Addiction Services in Newtown with the Salvation Army. So your last slide here, hallelujah, and the reflection and transcendence, was there a lot of thanksgiving? Like
absolutely, yes.
Gratitude?
Yes, yes. That would fall under the clarity, the gratitude for family, for safety, their homes, everything. But also, several of the participants said, they really grew from the experience, and in a weird way, they're actually grateful for what happened.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm Julie Cope, and I lived through the experience of the earthquake, as did a number of people in this room now. And one of the things that came out of it was the fact that, for myself personally, is that I think about how I say things. I no longer say that I'm blessed because I was at home and I was okay. Around the wording that we use, because my cousin was injured in a building. So when I'm saying that I'm blessed because I was at home, was she blessed? not blessed because she was in a building. And so just around the language that we use.
Yes.
And one of the other things around that was the thankfulness and the gratefulness, but also around the fact that I used to say that I now live abnormally, but actually it's become the new norm. And so there's things that happen that becomes a new norm and a new way of thinking things and thinking through things.
Right.
But don't underestimate, because the quakes are still going. It was 5 years of constant, just not the 2 years. So when you're talking with people, and I'm not sure about others who are there that are sitting in this building, are you okay? Actually underneath, we did survive, but there are some changes and they're a learning process every day.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
Thank you. We're doing very well for time.
Kia ora, Mike from the Salvation Army. I just wonder, in the participants, was there a sense of, or did you come across the idea of powerlessness that contributed to how people navigated their responses?
Yeah, there's one that jumps to my mind who, of all 16 participants, she kind of fought the acceptance. And yes, part of how I framed my research was through a transactional model of coping, where they talk about problem-focused coping, emotion-focused coping, meaning-focused coping, and I'm looking at transcendent coping as an addition in there that weaves throughout all of those. And she very much functioned from a problem-focused. Like, she got in there, she worked with people, she tried to help her smaller community recover. And she did have a sense of powerlessness, but it was nature that was her particular salvation. She said, when it got so bad, she just realized that the sun comes up every day, the trees are still there, and she would go out into her garden. She had to be out in nature, and that's what helped her transcend it.
Hey, I'm Alex, a research fellow at Victoria University in restorative justice. And I'm curious, from sort of some of the other work I've done, it's always been really fascinating when people's sort of capacity to endure hardship. Some people can, and this is a gross generalization, some people can have that tendency of, why me? And some people can have that tendency of, well, I'm glad it's not as bad as it could have been. And I'm curious from your research, how sort of people's connectedness to a spiritual sort of dimension in their lives, if there was sort of any connection to where on that spectrum people then sat of the poor me, why did this happen to me, versus I am so glad that I'm alive. If that makes sense as a question.
Of course it does, yeah, thank you. I did not get that sense of poor me. Probably because the people who came forward had used spirituality to assist their recovery. The one minister that participated in the survey talked about his perspective of looking at the people in his congregation, and he talked about that, your exact issue, how the people he thought would never deal with this just sailed through it, and others just crumbled, basically. So, yeah, but my 16 were pretty strong.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Just coming from that, drawing from that, wasn't it Nietzsche who said the man or the person who has a why to live can cope with almost any how? Yeah. And there was that chap, Viktor Frankl, who did that research, right, in the concentration. Yeah. Can you say something about that in relation to your research?
Course. Yep. I've just been writing about that in my thesis. Tragic optimism, Viktor Frankl developed that concept. So finding meaning is a very spiritual practice, right? So for many people, just drawing a blank, but it's connected to their values and people. The last participant said, it's all about people. So for most people, meaning in their life is connected to their relationships, right? And so that's what became their focus.
And I guess we've heard from, in the previous session, a lady who said about relationships and whānau and embedding.
And connectedness.
And connectedness,
Connectedness,
yes.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Yes?
just going off on a different tangent to some extent, I'm sure there was examples of sort of like survivor's guilt as well involved in people that had been exposed to the earthquakes in Christchurch. But the mass shootings in Christchurch in March, I was off sick that day, and I felt guilty about not being at work. And I've also spoken to other people that were sort of on holiday or away for whatever reason. And I've even spoken to the consultant physicians who said, I'm not a surgeon, I felt guilty about not being able to operate on the patients. So, you know, these traumatic events can have some bizarre effects on people. Yeah. And, I felt sort of stupid originally, thinking, what am I feeling guilty about? You know, I wasn't in a fit state to go to work anyway. But hearing that other people had had similar experiences or similar feelings actually made me feel an awful lot better about it.
Sure. One of my participants did react exactly that way, especially after the February 22nd earthquake. She was not in the city, and exactly she had that reaction. For some reason, she felt guilty. I share your sense of guilt on that day. I actually flew back to Canada on March 15th, and surprised I was able to leave the Christchurch earthquake airport. Yeah, and I think that really speaks to all of our connectedness to each other. The fact that what happens to some happens to all of us.
Perhaps I've been too efficient with my time. Oh, yes, we've got another one.
Thank you so much. And also the pace that you set with your talk, it was really nice and calm. It's quite fast, isn't it, the 10 minutes? Just wanted to know, how did you recruit your participants, and also at what time frame post-February were you actually carrying out your interviews? So how far along their journey were they? Because I'd sort of interested to know, would you look at going back and seeing how that transcendence journey continues?
Right. Recruitment was difficult. I initially put posters up and an advertisement, and a story was done in a local newspaper. I started in a smaller community just outside of Christchurch, and didn't get a response. So, but I did get one response eventually from that. And so then it was just a matter of, I would talk to people, I would go to different functions, different events in Christchurch, the Green Expo, an art show, and because of my accent, people would be curious, why are you here? And I'd explain. And I think I mentioned to you earlier, once they heard the topic, their eyes either glazed over and they couldn't get away from me fast enough, or immediate engagement. And so it was sort of a snowball recruitment. People would recommend other people. And so those interviews took place in 2017, 2 years ago. And so that was 5 years down the track. I forgot to mention how I started getting into what made me begin this research is that I was visiting. My husband had finished his PhD research, and we were visiting in Ashburton. We were house sitting, and that was in 2015. And I was reading the paper, cover to cover, and seeing that people were still struggling, still dealing with this. And that's when I thought, because my passion is spirituality and wellness, how can that play a role in this? And 6 months later, I was back in New Zealand doing this research. But yes, unfortunately, I don't have the time or finances to go back to reconnect with the people. I'm not sure what may happen in the future.
Wonderful. Will you join me in thanking all our three speakers, Lucy, Noel, and Susan? And we have a little thank you for each of you.